Joni Lamb, the powerful voice behind Daystar, is now at the center of a shocking financial scandal. Accused of embezzling funds from the very ministry she helped build, longtime viewers and insiders are left stunned. Whispers of secret accounts, hidden transactions, and betrayal at the highest level are surfacing fast. Is this the unraveling of Christian media's most untouchable empire? The truth is coming out, and it's darker than anyone imagined. It didn't begin with a headline or an investigation. It began with a simple moment. A quiet board meeting at Daystar. Just 3 people in the room. Joni Lamb, the woman at the top of the network. Her longtime friend, Tom Callender, someone she trusted completely. And her son, Jonathan Lamb, who had grown up watching his family build a Christian media empire. The mood wasn't tense, not yet. But it shifted quickly when Jonathan asked one question. Just one. Mom, did you really use $100,000, 0 cents of Daystar money for your honeymoon? That question changed everything. Jonathan wasn't trying to make a scene. He wasn't raising his voice or accusing anyone. But he saw something that didn't feel right, and he couldn't ignore it. His mother had recently gotten married to Dr. Doug Weiss, and they'd taken a luxury honeymoon. One that didn't come cheap. The problem? According to what was said in that room, it was funded by ministry money that donors had given, believing it would go to ministry work, to spreading the gospel, to helping others, not to a personal trip for the founder of the network. And then came the moment that made Jonathan's stomach turn. Tom Callender, sitting beside Joni, casually said, "We'll just gift it to her," as if $100,000, 0 cents, wasn't a big deal. As if no one would care. As if the people who gave those dollars didn't matter. There was no vote, no serious discussion, just a quick decision made behind closed doors. That was it, the meeting moved on, but Jonathan couldn't. Something inside him shifted. He sat with it, thought about it, prayed about it. And the more he reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't right. It didn't matter if his mom was the one in question. It didn't matter how long Tom had been around. It didn't even matter that they tried to call it a gift. It was donor money. It belonged to the people who had sacrificed to give it, people who trusted Daystar to use it wisely. And he knew deep down that if he didn't say something, no one ever would. So, he spoke up. Quietly at first. He told people he trusted. He shared what had happened in that room. He didn't go to the press with a vendetta. He wasn't trying to embarrass his mom. But he understood the weight of what he had seen, and he couldn't live with staying silent. Eventually, word got out, and once it did, everything exploded. Suddenly, Joni was on the defensive. She claimed she had paid the money back, that it wasn't embezzlement, just a misunderstanding. But the timing was suspicious. The money wasn't returned until after the questions began, after people started digging, after Jonathan raised the alarm, and that's when people started asking the harder questions. Would she have paid it back if no one found out? Would the public ever have known if Jonathan hadn't said anything? This wasn't just a mistake. It felt like a betrayal. Not just because of the money, but because of what it represented. The idea that leadership at Daystar could spend massive amounts of donor funds on personal luxury, quietly, with no outside accountability. And the only reason it came to light was because a son had the courage to confront his own mother in the name of integrity. That moment, when Jonathan looked across the boardroom table and said, "You can't do this," was when the truth first slipped out. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in that small, private space, one voice cracked open something much bigger. It was the first crack in the foundation, the first moment when the lights began to shine on what had been hidden in the dark. And once that light came in, there was no turning back. Daystar wasn't just a network, it was an empire. For millions of viewers around the world, it looked like a shining light in Christian media, a place where faith came first, where prayers were broadcast daily, and where Joni Lamb stood smiling beside her family, preaching messages of hope, love, and truth. But behind the lights, the camera, and the carefully rehearsed sermons was a system that looked very little like a church, and even less like accountability. Most people didn't realize it, but Daystar wasn't just a television network. It was legally registered as a church. That one detail made all the difference. By calling itself a church for tax purposes, Daystar didn't have to do what most nonprofits do. No annual 990 forms. No open books. No financial disclosures. In short, they didn't have to tell the public where the money was going, and that allowed Joni Lamb to run things in near total secrecy. and run them she did. After the passing of her husband Marcus Lamb, Joni became the primary face and force behind Daystar. While she often appeared humble and spiritual on camera, she was the one calling the shots behind the scenes. She controlled the finances, she signed the checks, she approved the projects. And she didn't answer to a large board or outside advisors. She answered to herself, her close friend Tom Callender, and her son, Jonathan. 3 people overseeing a multi-million-dollar religious operation. That's not a church, that's a private club. This structure wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. Because when money is flowing in from people's pockets and there's no one watching where it goes, it creates the perfect setup for abuse. Donors were giving out of faith. Some were tithing every month. Some were sending in their last $20, believing they were contributing to something holy. They thought they were supporting missionaries, spreading the gospel, helping the hurting. What they didn't know was how those funds were actually being handled, and Joni never volunteered the information. There were no audits, no reports, no outside financial reviews, nothing to reassure the people in the pews that the money was being used with care. And because Daystar was classified as a church, the IRS didn't require anything more. No one was breaking any laws on paper. But spiritually? Ethically? It felt like something else entirely. For a long time, people didn't question it. After all, the broadcasts looked beautiful, the music was uplifting, the preaching was familiar, and Joni, she had that way of speaking that made people feel like they knew her, like she was part of their own church family. It didn't occur to most viewers that behind that image was a structure with no real transparency, a structure that gave Joni the ability to use donor money however she saw fit, and no one could stop her. That's what made the $100,000 0 cents honeymoon so shocking. Not just the amount, not just the fact that it was spent on a personal luxury trip, but the fact that it was approved. That within Daystar's own leadership, spending that kind of money on a private vacation wasn't flagged, challenged, or even seriously discussed, except by Jonathan. That shows just how much power Joni had. Power she used not just to guide a ministry, but to operate it as her own. People began to look closer. They started to notice that Daystar didn't function like a typical church. There were no congregants gathering weekly, no pastors shepherding a local community, no physical place of worship where the faithful could go for prayer and fellowship. Instead, there were cameras, sound stages, corporate offices, luxury furnishings, and production schedules. It looked more like a Christian media brand than a church, and yet it carried all the tax protections and secrecy that churches are legally allowed. And for Joni, that setup was perfect. She could preach about humility and faith from one side of the camera while writing checks on the other. She could ask for donations to fund kingdom work without ever showing how that money was spent. And because of how Daystar was registered, she didn't have to. That's what made it all feel so dangerous. Not just the actions, but the system that allowed it. As the scandal grew, many people asked, how did this go unnoticed for so long? The answer was simple. It was built that way. The very foundation of Daystar allowed it to be hidden. With no outside eyes, no routine audits, and no financial accountability, Joni didn't have to hide anything, because she was never required to reveal anything in the first place. Some would say, but it's a church. That's the defense people clung to. But what does that really mean anymore? A true church exists to serve people, to uplift communities, to preach the word and live by it. But Daystar wasn't doing that in the traditional sense. It was a broadcast machine, led by a family and a friend, collecting millions and answering to no one. That's not a ministry, that's a brand. And when the public realized what was going on, they were devastated. Viewers who had given for years suddenly felt betrayed, not just because of the money, but because of the illusion. They thought they were supporting something sacred, something eternal, but they were funding a system that operated more like a business than a church. And at the center of it all was Joni Lamb, smiling, preaching, and quietly holding the reins. The hardest part for many was knowing they had trusted her, that they had cried during her broadcasts, sent in prayer requests, given what little they had, and now they were left with questions, ones they weren't getting answers to. Because even when Joni finally admitted she had paid the money back, there was no explanation, no apology, just a quiet shrug and a return to the camera, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and it shook people to their core. Because what they thought was a church, what they believed was a ministry, turned out to be something else entirely. A protected system, a closed loop. And for Joni, it worked. Until the truth started slipping out, and once it did, nothing looked the same again. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. It wasn't just another Christian gossip piece. It wasn't just a controversy people could scroll past. This hit differently. This was Joni Lamb, the face of Daystar. The woman so many viewers had trusted, cried with, prayed with. For years she had sat under studio lights, telling people to stay strong, stay faithful, and stay honest. But now, everything felt upside down. A luxury honeymoon paid for with ministry money? A $100,000, 0 cents gift approved behind closed doors? People couldn't believe what they were hearing. At first there was silence, a long, awkward silence. Joni didn't go live to explain. Daystar didn't release a statement. No press conference, no repentance, just nothing. Viewers waited. Supporters waited. Donors waited. But the people who had given their money, their loyalty, their belief, they were met with a blank wall, and that silence did more damage than words ever could. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It became about trust. Because when you trust someone with your prayers, your tithes, your faiths, when you open your heart and believe they represent something holy, and then they go silent when they're caught, it feels like betrayal, not just financial, spiritual. People took to social media. Videos started showing up on YouTube. Former supporters uploaded tearful reactions. Some shared their own stories, how they'd given to Daystar for years, how Joni's words had helped them during hard times, how they'd felt like part of her extended spiritual family, and now they felt used. One woman commented, "I gave $50, 0 cents a month for 10 years. I thought I was giving to God's work. Now I don't even know what that money paid for." Another wrote, "It's not about the $100,000, 0 cents. It's about the lies. It's about the fact that they didn't even think we deserved an explanation." These weren't internet trolls or critics looking for a scandal. These were real people, faithful believers, donors who had trusted Daystar for decades. The backlash grew quickly. Christian blogs picked up the story. Religious podcasts started discussing it. Former Daystar insiders started hinting at other things: luxury clothing, private flights, expensive dinners. Maybe the honeymoon wasn't the only personal expense paid for with donor money, but the problem was, without any financial transparency, there was no way to prove it. No one outside the inner circle could see the books. That's how Daystar had been set up from the beginning. No required financial disclosures, no annual reports, no accountability, and that made people even more angry. The silence from Daystar felt like a slap in the face. Joni continued appearing on TV as if nothing had happened. She smiled, she hosted, she preached, but behind the scenes, something had shifted. The trust that held the ministry together had cracked. Donations slowed, viewership declined. Some churches that once supported Daystar stopped promoting it. Others quietly backed away, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. People didn't want to hear more sermons. They wanted answers. They wanted someone to look them in the eye and say, "We were wrong." But instead what they got was more silence. Eventually, Joni did say something. She claimed she had paid the money back. But there were no details, no receipts, no timeline, no apology, just a quick acknowledgement and then business as usual. But for many, that wasn't enough. Because if it hadn't been reported, if her own son hadn't spoken up, would the money have ever been returned at all? And that's what kept echoing in people's minds. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a window into how the system worked. A system where decisions were made in private by 3 people. A system where money from elderly widows, single moms, and struggling families could be spent without oversight. A system where questions were dismissed and accountability didn't seem to exist. Jonathan Lamb became the quiet hero of the story. He hadn't gone to the media with a grudge. He hadn't launched an attack on his mother. He had simply done the right thing. He asked questions. He raised concerns. And when he realized it wasn't being handled the way it should have been, he told the truth. And for many people, that act meant everything. He was the reason they even knew what had happened. He was the one voice in the room who refused to be silent. But the fallout kept growing. Supporters split into two camps, those who still believed in Joni and wanted to forgive her, and those who walked away completely. Some tried to defend her, saying everyone makes mistakes. Others couldn't get past the fact that she hadn't taken responsibility, that she hadn't faced the people who trusted her, that she hadn't said the words that needed to be said. "I'm sorry, I failed you." Instead, the ministry kept moving forward, hoping the storm would pass. But it didn't, because this wasn't just about money. It was about broken faith. And when faith is broken, it doesn't heal easily, especially when the wound is met with denial and deflection. People who had built their spiritual lives around Daystar were now reevaluating everything. What was real? What was performance? Who was Joni Lamb really? Behind her smile, something had changed. People saw it, felt it, and no amount of studio lighting could cover that kind of fracture. The Daystar brand was still there. The shows still aired. The cameras still rolled. But the heart of it, the belief that this was a sacred, trustworthy ministry, had been shaken. And in its place was something harder to define: doubt, disappointment, and a deep desire for truth. Many former donors said they would never give to a ministry again. They felt burned. Not just by Joni, but by the whole system that allowed something like this to happen. A system that hid behind legal definitions like church to avoid transparency. A system where spiritual leaders could act like CEOs and face no consequences. That's why the silence hurts so much. Because people expected better. Not perfection, but honesty. Not excuses, but accountability. Joni Lamb had built a media empire on the foundation of faith, but in the fallout of one moment, that foundation cracked. And while the building still stood, the trust that held it up was never the same again. The damage had already been done. By the time Joni Lamb admitted she paid the $100,000, 0 cents back, the public had moved past the money. What they wanted wasn't a refund. They wanted truth. They wanted someone to finally stand in front of the camera, look into their eyes, and tell them how something like this could have happened. But that moment never came, and because it didn't, the questions just got louder, the trust more fragile, and the ministry that once felt untouchable suddenly looked exposed. People began to realize that Daystar had operated behind a curtain for far too long. It wasn't just about one transaction. It was about years of secrecy, about a structure that was designed to keep outsiders out, about a leadership circle so tight that real accountability never had a chance. And when the lights were finally turned on, thanks to one honest voice inside that room, the illusion fell apart. For the first time, longtime supporters started asking the questions they never thought they'd ask. Where did my money go? Who really makes the decisions? Has this happened before? How many other gifts were handed out without anyone knowing? The answers didn't come. And in that silence, more people walked away. The thing is, when you give to a ministry, you're not just handing over money. You're giving a piece of your heart, your belief, your trust. Whether it's $5 or $500, you give because you believe that ministry is doing something bigger than yourself, something godly, something eternal. But when that gift is misused, even once, it feels like a personal betrayal. And when there's no apology, no confession, and no attempt to rebuild the bridge, it leaves a scar. That's what happened with Daystar. People weren't just angry. They were heartbroken. Some had been giving monthly for 10, 15, even 20 years. Some had never missed a broadcast. Others had called the prayer line in tears, had felt comforted by Joni's voice, had believed they were part of something real. But now, it felt like all of that had been built on a stage, carefully crafted, carefully scripted, and now painfully cracked. And now. And as more details emerged, the structure of Daystar came under fire. The fact that it operated as a church meant it never had to share financial records with the public. No one outside the core team knew what was happening with the books. There were no donor reports, no third-party audits, no required transparency. That setup had protected them for years, and Joni had used it, some say manipulated it, to operate with near-total freedom. But that freedom came at a cost, because once the public saw how easy it was for a ministry to handle millions of dollars without oversight, people started asking bigger questions. Not just about Daystar, but about all ministries like it. Why is there no accountability? Why are religious leaders allowed to build empires without financial checks? Why are we trusting systems that refuse to show us where our money goes? What happened with Joni Lamb opened a door, and once people stepped through it, they didn't stop walking. Christian watchdog groups picked up the story. Churchgoers started organizing discussions. Even secular media began to take interest, not because they cared about Daystar, but because it represented something larger, a pattern, a loophole, a structure that made it possible for any religious leader to misuse funds without legal consequences, simply by calling their operation a church. And now the demand was growing. Accountability. People didn't want to destroy Daystar. They didn't want to see ministries collapse. They just wanted the truth. They wanted systems in place to make sure this didn't happen again. They wanted donors to be protected, money to be tracked, and leadership to be held to the same standards they preached from the stage. And most of all, they wanted the people at the top to remember who they served, not themselves, not their lifestyle, not their image, but the people, the givers, the believers. Joni, for her part, kept moving forward. She didn't step down. She didn't issue a public confession. She kept showing up on camera, surrounded by lights and music, doing what she had always done. But behind the scenes, nothing was the same. Some insiders said the team was fractured, that morale had dropped, that viewership and donations were down. And while Joni acted like it was business as usual, many could feel the weight behind her smile. It wasn't the same anymore. The innocence was gone.